Hi everyone. Alex just appeared in the waiting room. Hi. I'm sorry we are starting a little bit late. Maybe there are going to be more people that are going to come in. But well, let me just welcome you to the Speculative Legal Theory Network. This is the first meeting of our second year after a quick break, and we didn't ask for you to read anything this time, and we didn't invite any special guests like most previous meetings. Instead, we wanted to just have an opportunity for us to meet and talk a little bit about your own work and how you think it might connect to these open-ended definitions and concepts that we are associating with this idea of speculative legal theory. So yeah, if you want to talk a little bit about yourself and about what you have been doing, you can say it maybe in the chat. Ermanno Napolitano already said that he would like to present himself, so maybe he can be the first one. But anyway, in case you're just arriving now, this is a network that we've started last year with this idea of trying to connect people around the whole planet who might be in one way or another interested in the connection between legal thought and a group of different contemporary theoretical currents, such as speculative realism, new materialism, so-called ontological turn in anthropology, post-humanism, actor network theory, assemblage theory, all of those kind of different tags that are used in different disciplines to give different interpretations of a series of contemporary developments that have some themes in common, among which are this idea of rehabilitating speculation in the sense of metaphysical speculation as opposed to the priority of epistemological questions, and also a renewed focus on problems involving the non-human or decentering the human from the focus of thought. So opening more space to questions about new technologies, about ecology, etc. So yeah, maybe if you want, Ermanno, you can start by telling us a little bit about you and your research.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. It's still dark here. It's like I'm in Canada at 7 in the morning. So I'm doing my research in international law slash environmental law. Broadly speaking, under the supervision of Professor Kirsten Anker at McGill University. And I I I saw this group some times ago on a YouTube video, and I was extremely interested in joining. I think it's an extremely valuable opportunity. I also recently read your last article that you sent me. It's amazing. I hope to send comments soon. I had a little bit of up and down in this period. And so my research project is um, essentially focuses on the governance of climate, um, and use the specter of solar geoengineering as a um, main research question, in the sense that um, we are as humanity, we are posed in front of these scenario, no, whether to use it or not, and what are the ethical implications and the legal implications, but also what are the implications of both of this perspective and of the eventual use of solar geo, in terms of governance, in terms of keeping the status quo, or eventually in terms of helping us moving from the current status quo. And so I'm exploring different theories. Right now, um, I'm also, undertaking some readings from authors from the anthropology department of McGill, and I'm particularly interested in um, giving, let's say, decentralize, of course, the governance paradigm from an anthropocentric perspective to an ecocentric one, but also understanding what is the meaning of an ecological uh, uh, system of governance. Um, I've read many times, for example, that the potential solution may be like a fiduciary theory that will assign to us, essentially, as a humans, like the duty to the fiduciary duty to steward the planet. But I think that this also is the other face of the same coin, in the sense it's still an anthropocentric approach, despite despite many authors says that this is uh, like a potential step towards an ecological one. And so I'm questioning whether we should surpass these also, but also how. Um, and of course, in these terms, speculative legal theory is key for me, because in the end, um, perhaps part of my research will be speculative in this sense. Um, so this is essentially my background. I also had the opportunity to spend 1 year Harvard University, where they are studying the technology to engineer the planet. So I had the opportunity to exchange with um, various scientists working on these, um, and being exposed to a completely new world. So that for me it was good to develop a sort of non-expert understanding that will help me uh, moving forward with my thesis. Um, yeah, so that's me essentially. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's nice to know that you are working with Kirsten Anker, who is someone who has presented last year her paper Law as Forest. It was one of the first people that we have thought about inviting, and one of the main references that we have, though she doesn't necessarily use that word, she is one of the people that we are thinking of when we talk about speculative legal theory, in the sense that her work connects somehow with especially with the ontological turn in anthropology. I think bringing bringing themes from contemporary anthropology and trying to establish theoretical dialogue, and not just like taking as an object, but establishing an actual theoretical dialogue with non-modern indigenous thought, which is really interesting because we're talking about opening discussion about non-human laws such as new technologies and ecological law, but also indigenous thought, though we are talking about humans. It's also involved in this because of how there has been a lot of recent acknowledgement of how much different worldviews reorganize these distinctions between human and non-human. They don't necessarily erase this distinction, but they give us alternative ways of distributing the relation between what counts as human or as non-human in each situation. So yeah, does anyone want to make any comments about Ermanno's presentation and his research?
It sounds very exciting. I'm looking forward to learning more about it. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Well, does anyone, after we give our initial presentations, then we can maybe make more connections between the different ones. So maybe does anyone else want to talk a little bit about themselves and what connected them to this network?
I'm happy to say something. I'm Alex, and I have attempted to join previous meetings, the Margaret Davies one, but my signal was awful that day, and I was not able to follow. And since then, I've been a bit overwhelmed with teaching. But it's a really great initiative, and I hope to be able to participate in the subsequent sessions. I think today there's strike action for UK universities, which might account for a lot of UK people not, deciding not to attend because people feel differently on the spectrum of what kind of activities they permit themselves to engage in on strike days, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, my research is based. I mean, I'm from an anthropology background, but my PhD was in law, and it was an ethnographic study of the Anthropocene Working Group. So the group of geologists who are trying to formalize the Anthropocene as a new unit, who are partly indebted to Paul Crutzen, who was a huge advocate of full-blown geoengineering in a very problematic way. But the study was just trying to describe what that process of formalizing a new unit actually entails. Like, what does it mean to define a new geological unit in the 21st century that's specific to the 21st century?
Mm-hmm.
Because most other units have already been discussed for decades, if not over a century. Even like the Holocene has a history that goes back to the 19th century. So they kind of started this from scratch now, and the majority of geologists are quite opposed to the formalization of a new Anthropocene, not on the grounds of climate change denialism, but on the grounds of methodological inconsistency, right?
Yeah.
So I kind of described that process, and I've tried to write about it in an article of mine, but now I'm turning it into a book, and kind of part of the arguments that I'm trying to make is that there's actually, the way that a lot of law deals with the Anthropocene is to assume a certain level of coherence, particularly in the geological formalization of the Anthropocene, and then to apply law, as if to say, like, great, we lawyers can demonstrate how the capacity of law to respond to the preeminent existential crises by, we can use legal personhood, or we can use all these amazing techniques to resolve problems. And of course, that's problematic in itself. But also, I'm trying to say that there's already a kind of juridical process in geology itself that I think lawyers could, and everyone could do well to understand the extent of the kind of normative procedures that characterize geological processes. And that is, I mean, I can talk about that a bit more afterwards, but it involves a majority vote from a panel of expert geologists who review decisions and determine whether the proposal is consistent with the existing precedent of previous decisions. So kind of I try and argue that the geological chart itself, which is the documents that the Anthropocene would be added to, is a kind of, it's a codified, it's a kind of code of law. It's a body of legislation that, and I'm trying to make some point about how before we make the distinction between science and law, there's a process of knowledge production that the Anthropocene formalization effort reveals, separate from the problem of did it start in 1610 or 1950. Any such assertion is clearly inadequate, but separate to that process of making an assertion about what the planet is or is not has some resonance with law, even before we make the law science distinction. And I'm not really sure how to do that. And I'm kind of post-PhD have a bit of a trauma about kind of making those kinds of big claims, but yeah.
I think that's incredible. Does anyone have any comments?
I find it very interesting. I'm wondering if, because I just downloaded an article of yours. I'm wondering if it is some of what you say is in this article, or you
It is.
would
I
like
mean,
to
I wrote that article slightly under duress. It was kind of a condition of a postdoc I was doing, was to get this article out ASAP. And so, I'm trying to make this argument in that paper. I explain the formalization process in that paper, and I try and make an argument about how a lot of legal literature, I think, we all know already that the anthropos is a super problematic term. We've known that for a long time, and no one's I'm just trying to say we need to kind of reframe the way that legal scholars respond to the Anthropocene slightly, because no one's surprised by the fact that the anthropos is a conceptual artifact in itself, right? I don't know, but I try in that article is the short answer.
Yeah, I'm really interested in reading some of your work about that. It sounds like yeah, I mean, I'm already starting to get a sense of the connections between the work of you guys and my own, and what we've been discussing here on the network, even in the sense of this kind of contemporary tension that exists between geoengineering and the kind of ecological decentering of the human. And I usually particularly tend to be somewhere in the middle, thinking that we have to take certain measures, like we shouldn't just try to sort of suddenly vanish into the background and say we have nothing to do with this. Like we've already started doing some kind of transformative. We started actively transforming the planet in a way that is uncontrolled, and I think there's a responsibility involved with that. But at the same time, I think one challenge that we have that is quite a theoretical and philosophical challenge is how to think about acting in some way in relation to this new situation, but without presupposing the same kind of grand narrative about human control or the idea of engineering or the idea of stewardship or anyway, and these ideas that still sort of presuppose this distinction. What you're discussing seems to blur this distinction between the, you know, I was thinking about this, like this famous Latourian distinction between those two ways of producing the bifurcation of the constitution of the moderns, right, where science is going to produce the facts and courts and political institutions are going to produce freedom and agents, and what you're showing seems to be something like a place that's not exactly on one or the other side of this, and which is at the very inception of this. I think it's an interesting inversion or produces a certain feedback in the sense that often people have been making the argument like, since we are now in the Anthropocene, this fundamental bifurcation it doesn't stand anymore because the human has become a geological agent. And it seems like you're showing that this idea itself is produced in a way that is structured by those different ways of producing knowledge and of making judgments, and at the same time it is kind of complicating those two modes. So yeah, I'm probably going to read that and use it for something eventually. I don't know exactly what, but it sounds really useful for the kind of discussion that we are trying to have. I don't know if I got it right. I mean, it's still my first contact.
I don't know if I got it right either. Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm going to pronounce your name right, if it's Favour or Favour. Are you there? Do you want to tell us a bit about your work?
Yes, it's Favour, like the English word Favour. Yes. So is it all right if I shared my thoughts about Ermanno and Alex's research before I talked about mine?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay. So I don't know very much about law and anthropology or environmental issues and sustainability beyond the basic, elemental, rudimentary kind of stuff. Like we should care for our environment and not take more than we need and stuff like that. So I think when Ermanno was talking, there was something that yesterday evening I was listening to this podcast by it's a theological podcast, and one of the invited guests, Sandra Wichita, I don't know how to pronounce the name, she was talking about biblical justifications for ecological ecological sustainability, essentially, and trying to make an argument for why it is biblical, so to speak, for human beings to take only what they need from land, for instance, and why and certain acts of ecological terrorism, for instance, in the Bible, practiced by the Assyrians, like salting the land, and why some of these laws regarding following came to be. And there's this conversation that I have been observing that occurs for instance, in tech policy. I used to work as a tech policy researcher before I started my PhD. And in AI specifically, there's a lot of recent focus on African perspectives, and I'm not sure if it's the same everywhere, but I think that it's probably also in a way tied to the growth of the centering of indigenous perspectives and how the environment or land or ethics, for instance, frameworks and perspectives should be considered. I guess I have my comment is boiling down to a question regarding how in your research you consider if there are conflicts between, I guess, indigenous, if you consider there to be a conflict or a difference between indigenous and secular modes of knowledge as it relates to drawing wisdom or ethics for as it relates to your research, I guess, conservation. So that was what occurred to me. Yes, and that's because for instance in Africa, I'm from Nigeria, but in parts of East Africa, for instance, Uganda, certain trees like the baobab tree were considered sacred, but during colonialism, they were cut down and chopped for lumber and stuff like that. And what happened was that because these trees had root systems that were useful for holding soil together and for preserving other life forms, it has felling them has contributed to drought and the death of plant and animal life in many parts of those places. And I was thinking that it seems that there is a difference between, or maybe there isn't, I don't know, a difference between preserving or returning to indigenous or cultural values. Is it possible without divesting from, I guess, cultural or social, cultural and religious practices? I feel that there is some sort of tension there, and I have been thinking about this for a while. So that's my question. And I don't know if I should continue, if I should pause it. Should I continue?
Can you just you just said about returning from preserving or returning to indigenous values without something that I didn't quite get. Without what happening? Can you
without divesting, I think, from the religious elements of indigenous values, so to say. I think that's what I'm trying to think about.
But why exactly, can you elaborate a bit on why you think that returning to those values would tend to divest from those religious elements?
Well, I think that in the African context, especially, I think part of the influence of colonialism is that it brought with it Christianity, for instance, and part of the practices involved with, I guess, deforestation and capitalism, then brought along with it a sort of, so we had this, there would be huge groves of trees or forests that were tagged evil forests, for instance. But with the advent of Christianity came, I guess, the death of, I want to say, superstition, so to say. And so people were no longer, I guess, afraid of or in awe of this natural artifacts, so to say. And I guess that sort of explains part of why it was so easy to not care for those parts of our ecology.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Does anyone want to ask? Because I think it was directed to you guys. Do you want to comment on something? Otherwise, I can comment as well.
I guess the one thing, I mean, it would appear to me that the idea of returning back to something is not is something to be a bit suspicious of, right? Precisely because the idea of a return to something, I don't know how to put it. It's kind of, that in itself is a fiction. It's not a true, thing to return to something. The multiplicity of accounts of what you would be returning to mean that it will necessarily be a new invention, something new. And there are plenty of ways, especially in the law, where the idea of a return to something has been an opportunity instead to perpetuate the kind of the thing that ended or interrupted what allegedly came before, right? I don't know if that makes sense the way that I say it, but in other words, that we can't help but kind of create. Sorry, that's probably kind of a bit too vague. But I don't. Is that coming across what I'm trying to say? That kind of, what is it? It's not possible to return back to something. So I would be skeptical of any proposal that law would make that suggested that much.
That makes me think of some discussions like about even like here in Latin America. Sometimes it's kind of discussed, this relation between indigenous ways of living and the ecological question. Sometimes it's put in terms of, indigenous people live like they have always used to live in harmony with the environment. And that is often questioned in the sense of saying that indigenous people are contemporaries. They have been and they are still transforming and adapting to different situations. So yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's just like how you just can't go back in time, and also how indigenous ways of thinking have themselves always been kind of transforming. So I think it's interesting to not to extract the consequence that, well, we can't go back to those indigenous perspectives that are capable of producing more ecological ways of relating with the environment. It's just that the way that you mobilize that, it's not going to be simply returning to some kind of pure and original state, but you're going to have to reconstruct that somehow. And as long as you're conscious that you're going to have to reconstruct it, you're going to go about it probably a bit differently, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, no one is stuck in time, right? And in some ways, the idea of a return to indigenous practices is a further instance of dehumanization, because those people, I mean, like everyone, we continue to adapt to circumstances, we continue to change. And so the idea to some extent that we return back to what those people used to be doesn't put those people on the same footing, doesn't put everyone on the same footing. It perpetuates a kind of myth of Western kind of technological superiority and a kind of, nativeness, right?
Yeah, but in any case, I don't think that's like that was like the center of what Favour was trying to say.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
No, absolutely. Sorry,
wasn't like the emphasis on the return thing. It's more about, okay, those people had a kind of way of seeing their relation with the environment, that even though it was something that was changing and adaptive, it still is something that was, until a certain point, protecting, making this forest something that was respected, and then eventually that stopped happening because of those views appearing as superstitious and being substituted by views either Christianity or capitalism. That's interesting, like the way you put it, that you put those two things together, because one has to do with like secularization, like capitalism is about a materialist, non-spiritual, non-religious way of dealing with things, but Christianity itself, which is still a spiritual religious view, is already, I think, an instantiation of a far more anthropocentric conception of the relation between human and nature. Like, since you have humans as one community of equals who are the children of God, and nature has been sort of created there as a kind of a background and something to be used or to be stewarded or to be explored to the benefit of humans. I certainly feel like there's already that there's already a disenchantment of nature in Christianity itself, and this disenchantment sort of makes nature much more vulnerable to being conceived of and consequently appropriated as a mere means for human ends, instead of being something that has its own personality and therefore its own legitimacy and its own needs, its own demands, right? So yeah, I'm certainly interested. I don't know about everyone, but I'm certainly interested in trying to rework legal concepts in this kind of interface between modern legal thought and other forms of thinking that have been gaining more theoretical interest recently, in the sense of seeing what the consequences can be for law of this sort of reconstruction, since it's not simply a return, but a sort of reconstruction of a certain animism or of a certain distribution of the relations between what counts as human or not, which is different from the modern one. And then maybe from there I can already introduce my own what I have been doing, and since it connects right there. I used to, I'm going to talk maybe later about the technological part, because my PhD was more about technology. But now in my postdoc, my research project has to do with extracting the consequences for legal thought of especially Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's work, which is part of this ontological turn in contemporary anthropology, and deals mainly with it deals with especially Amazonian, but also American in general, and eventually even outside of the American continent, but a family of cosmologies that have in common certain traces to some extent of what Viveiros de Castro calls perspectivism, and perspectivism is also the other side of what he calls multinaturalism, which is the idea that the distinction between what's human and what's non-human, or what is people and what is things, is not posited from the point of view of the universal. It's not always the same things that count as either one or the other thing, but what counts as people and what counts as things depends rather on the perspective from which you are determining this. And he observes that as something that happens in various indigenous cosmologies. And then what's interesting is that that's not simply an object of anthropological knowledge for him, but it's rather a kind of thought that ends up influencing his own meta-theoretical assumptions, and ends up not only affecting the very idea of what anthropology is or can be, but also in his later work starts sort of leaking into philosophy and into Western theoretical thought in general. And that I think is very interesting, in the sense that you see a kind of penetration of indigenous thought into the very theoretical philosophical discussion about very central concepts in philosophy and in the humanities. So since that is already there, I'm trying to sort of see what the consequences are of that sort of counter interpretation of Western concepts to the concepts of law, and how that can allow us to deal better with contemporary questions about how Western law relates to the problem of the relation between humans and non-humans. So there's a part that is sort of critical of the structures and the limits of what you can do with law as we understand it, since it is itself based in this nature versus culture bifurcation. Then there's a dimension about the very, right now in Brazil, it's a very tense, very contemporary and even violent problem. The question of indigenous territory and what that means, because we are in a country that was entirely appropriated from indigenous people, who themselves have had and still have widely varying ways of understanding what their relation is with territory, which are usually, or at least traditionally, not as centered in the striation and separation and the determination of a circumscribed territory, and the drawing of borders and the working of the land as a way of appropriating territory. So since the very Western concept of law and of property is so deeply related with this idea of how humans are supposed to relate to territory, where property comes from, the relation between property and agriculture and labor, and the relation between the nation state and the idea of a circumscribed territory, all of those things can be re-elaborated in ways that might have contemporary repercussions, which are precisely not something that you're going to simply come back to some kind of perfect harmony with nature that is a mirror of what indigenous peoples are supposed to have had at some point. But it's a very contemporary, very radically innovative, from the point of view of modern legal theory, group of concepts, of ideas, and of practices that we can and probably should and probably have a kind of an ethical duty to be able to enter into dialogue with if we want to change the way law is mediating our relation with nature. And then so my postdoc project has to do with that, and I'm going to be writing initially two papers on that. And recently I actually got Viveiros de Castro to accept to be my co-supervisor, so he's going to comment a bit on what I'm doing, give me some feedback, so I can, like, you know, make sure that I'm mobilizing his work in a more rich and more productive way. And the first paper is very connected to what you brought up, Favour, in the sense of how Hans Kelsen, who is obviously like one of the main references for modern 20th century legal theory, and especially in coded law countries like Brazil, there's this interesting and usually overlooked, I mean, I myself didn't ever give much thought to this, but there's a very key point in the pure theory of law where he's introducing the relation between law and science, which is very important for his project of a pure legal science. And for some reason, he seems to give a very important place to a theoretical character that appears there, which is the primitive animist. And he constructs this kind of narrative where he says, you know, the primitive animists, they had only a principle of imputation, which is to say they related to their environment in a way which is based on the idea of imputing intention and will and action and subjectivity in a way to whatever it is that they are encountering. So whether it's another human being, whether it is a tree, whether it is a forest, the way of relating to that is not to saying, well, this is an object, how can I establish objective knowledge of what are the rules that govern the activity of this thing, which are going to be rules that are going to be given by my judgment and by the properties of general experience, right? But rather it's like, okay, who is causing this to, or better, who is doing this? Like whatever it is that I see, my question is about someone who is responsible for that, whether it is a human like me or a human that is not like me, but is still someone, still a person, right? And Kelsen, of course, puts that as something that is below or has something missing. And then with modernity, he says that a different principle appears, a second principle, which is the principle of causality, which inaugurates the possibility of the natural sciences. And then the principle of imputation sort of becomes the specific domain of moral and legal thought, because legal knowledge is still normative knowledge. So legal knowledge is still based in this principle of imputation for Kelsen, but at the same time, it only becomes possible as a science since it is no longer the only principle with which you're relating to your environment, but it starts to share its responsibilities, so to speak, with this principle of causality, the scientific natural science principle of causality. So that's interesting and kind of puzzling why he sees the necessity in order to determine law as an objective science to contrast the modern situation of legal thought with this primitive animist conception of law. So not of law, but of everything. But in a way, what he's saying, even though he doesn't give much attention to that, is that in a way, those primitive animists, they saw everything in legal terms, in the sense that he constructs legal science, in the sense that they saw everything normatively. But since his conception of animism is quite outdated, because he draws from a conception of animism until like a certain time when there have been further developments about that concept, and then especially with this recent reinvigoration of anthropology, where the problem of animism has been sort of retaken through this idea of perspectivism, and transforming animism into perspectivism in a way. What I'm going to try to do in this paper is to see what does it do to a Kelsenian view of modern law and of legal thought in general if you introduce, in this place where he has animism as an important piece of his narrative, if you substitute animism with perspectivism, and then you sort of can do a kind of subversive reading of this very construction of legal theory, and I'm interested in understanding what kind of legal thought can come out of that, but precisely in a way such as to rehabilitate, using this kind of principle of imputation towards things like what you were saying, you know, like being able once again to look at those forests in a way that is not depersonalized, but at the same time not presupposing a kind of primitivist view of animism, but rather reconstructing legal theory in a contemporary way, in dialogue with the possibilities that emanate from this perspectivist and broadly speaking animist kind of thought. Yeah, and then there's other things, but I think I already talked a lot. I just thought I might introduce that since it connected to what Favour was bringing up.
How does he talk at all about pragmatism and kind of William James and Whitehead? And I mean, I'd be surprised if Kelsen. How does it relate?
Do you mean he? Do you mean Kelsen or Vivek?
Kelsen, yeah.
I don't think
I mean,
so.
I appreciate that's huge. Can you relate Kelsen to Whitehead? But I'm just wondering if there is, if you bring those things in together, or.
I don't know that Kelsen ever discussed. I mean, I would feel like Kelsen would not be very interested in that, since he has a very minimalist theory, you know, and Whitehead is quite expensive, and you know, this whole but at the same time, not necessarily Viveiros de Castro, at least not as something that appears that much in his writing, but for example, Isabelle Stengers, who is very close to him in terms of this contemporary ontological turn, or ecological thought, or cosmopolitical thought, is very much linked to Whitehead and to William James. So yeah, I think there is, like, I'm not in Kelsen himself, but I think once you start to do this kind of rereading of legal theory in connection to perspectivism, then I think a lot of connections start to appear in that direction.
That could be an interesting, like, future text. I know that you did one already on Hans Kelsen, but on a Whitehead one, perhaps.
Yeah, I actually did present. Now I had forgotten about that. I did present a text on Kelsen and Whitehead in a Whitehead conference, like in 2019. I think they had the International Whitehead Conference was here in Brasilia, And I was writing, I mean, I wasn't writing about Whitehead, but I was writing my thesis, and I was already trying to make those connections between legal theory and speculative thought. And I sort of tried to make this connection between Kelsen and Whitehead. I don't even remember exactly what I was working with, but it had to do with this bifurcation of nature thing. And yeah, how the bifurcation of nature is sort of presupposed in Kelsen's thought, and what happens if you sort of complicate that fundamental structure that is in the very center of modern legal thought, right? I can try to recover that, and I can send it to you if you want. It's a short presentation.
Yeah, that would be great.
Roberto Yamato just came in. Like, don't worry about
apologies for being so late and being my first time actually, although interest from the beginnings.
Yeah, that's great. It's great to have you here. We've met like quite a while ago, because my master's dissertation was about Derrida, and Roberto is a Derridian in the same university as me, but you are in international relations, right?
Yes, I am based in the International Relations Institute, the Department of International Relations here, and but have much interest in critical legal theory. And when you put together these, and some of my friends were also involved, and of course Betania, I am still very much interested. Unfortunately, last year I couldn't be part, and I had 2 little kids, so because of the time here, I had to be with them until now. So I could just join you guys now.
Yeah, no worries. It's good that you still came in, because I was afraid that people might not want to come in late, but it's important that you did, because we want to have as many people talk about their work and how it connects to the network as possible. So maybe we can you can talk a little bit about that yourself. I mean,
yeah, sure.
Unfortunately, you didn't get the previous presentations, but I think things are going to leak into the conversation, and you're going to be able to continue in the conversation with us.
First, I apologize to Ermanno, to Alex, and Favour. How do I pronounce your name? Favour.
It's Favour, just like
Favour.
music, right?
Favour. Apology, guys, for my being too late. So let me just try to share something about my current interests. So my background is both law and international relations. I did a PhD here at PUC in this department that I'm now working in IR in 2011. It was much influenced by the reading of Carl Schmitt and international law. The idea with Derrida was to kind of displace the international political thought of Carl Schmitt, but also trying to bring Derrida closer to kind of less, if you bear with me, the kind of a compartmentalizations of critical thought, less kind of a identified with post-structuralism, but more in this kind of indisciplined place, closer to post-colonial and decolonial thought, in a way much closer to Spivak. The thesis was focused on the constructions of enemies of mankind. So I engaged with the construction of the legal combatant in the war on terror, then the construction of, the idea of crimes against humanity and the enemy against humanity involved within the idea of criminals and enemies of humanity, and then went through a kind of a historical theoretical engagement with the figure of the pirate in the history of the international legal political thought. But mainly the idea was kind of problematizing the limits of the international and the kind of ontological constructions that legitimize the kind of emergence of modern international political legal constructions negatively. So the figure of the pirate and these other constructions served negatively to authorize and legitimize international law, international society, so on and so forth. After that, I decided to do a second PhD that brought me to Birkbeck in London, where I met some of the people that were invited to be part, like Dan Matthews and some other people that I saw in the list. I worked with Professor Peter Fitzpatrick there for 2 years. And since I'm trying to finish the thesis, so I just submitted my PhD thesis like last October, November. The thesis is called Before the End of the World. The end here, thanks so much. The end here as the connection, right? Not with E, but with A, the end of the world, a deconstruction of the interdisciplinary work on international law and international relations. So on the one hand, I'm engaging with like critical international legal thinking. So Marty Koskaniemi and some other people that in the last 2 or 3 years have been, trying to rethink the politics of international law in a critical way. On the one hand, much influenced by post-foundational political thought and at the reading of that, I've been trying to displace the focus on politics towards the political, but then problematizing the discussion of the political in 2 other ways. On the one hand, I try to problematize in these discussions the lack of attention on the supplement in a very Derridian fashion. So the international, so much attention is devoted to politics, to law, to the legal, to the political, but not to the work that the international does. What the international means when we adjectivize law and politics in international law and international politics. So a first displacement goes towards the political importance of the international, but in doing so, I want to bring kind of this Heideggerian, Derridian problematization between the ontic, the ontological, and the hauntological, right? To bring attention much more, not only to the politics of international law, but to the political politics or the ontological political questions in relation to the internet, in relation to the international, but then of course ending up with Derrida and problematizing the very ontology of the international and the political involved in that, with the hauntological. This prepares a move that I'm trying to kind of explore. And here I'm much influenced by some literature in IR and in international law, inspired by people like Peter Fitzpatrick, but also some other in law and RBJ Walker and Sergei Prozorov and others in IR that have been trying to problematize the difference between the international and the world, the international and what some people like Mario Blaser and Marisol de la Cadena are being kind of naming a world of many worlds in this kind of ontological turning the colonial thought, and how in this kind of deconstruction of international law has to be critically rethought and deconstructed before, and here I'm thinking Derrida's work on before the law and this kind of this boundary between the international and something that is beyond it, other worlds that are incommensurable to its methodological, ontological, epistemological assumptions, and languages. So I turn back to a kind of a reading of Derrida and law as language and law and language to try to suggest a kind of a differentiation in terms of the international as being something of the order of the ontological and the ontic, but not the ontological kind of things that you find in a reading of Derrida, such as in general text and différence, and the world closer to the world of many worlds of this decolonial turn, closer to what Derrida would associate with différence and articulation in general. So I end up my thesis there with some decolonial, post-colonial thought, but then problematizing what would be the politics, the political, the ethical moves when you realize the limits of your own politics, heritage, language, cosmovision. So here I'm thinking in Derrida's critique of Lévi-Strauss in terms of how in a certain encounters with tribes in Brazil, Lévi-Strauss, in order to find out the proper names of that people in a context where there was a prohibition of speaking about the proper names, he kind of make a trick offering some presents to the little kids in order to them to gossip the proper names, right? So Derrida in Of Grammatology does a critique of Lévi-Strauss and this kind of ethnocentric moves, even in, you know, people very much careful about the politics of and the critique of ethnocentrism, right? So in a way, this brings me to the importance of translation, understood here in a very broader sense, such as in the Dipesh Chakrabarti and some other people, right? And how deconstruction and post-colonial, decolonial thought, much especially when we are now so much more aware from, you know, coming from post-colonial Brazil, studying in critical places such as Birkbeck, about all these other cosmological productions coming from Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, Ailton Krenak here in Brazil, and so many other people, how to problematize this kind of political, ontological politics involving international law and politics, right? Opening or deconstructing certain constructions in order to put yourself before these other worlds, but also being very careful with this still ethnocentric kind of colonial moves in terms of other knowledges and other worlds. And here, you know, is where I'm trying to put myself in and try to think otherwise. I saw, you know, the work of I saw that the opening event of this group was Margaret Davis, right? And the engagement of her work. So in a certain way, knowing a bit of her previous work on Derrida and having read the developments of her Question the Law book, where she included new chapters in the last years, right? And doing a very interesting turn. I've been trying to accompany that, but trying to think the curve from Derrida towards this more contemporary engagement with materialism, with nature, with the world, through this re-engagement of this place that I read Derrida closer to post-colonial thinking and decolonial thought, and I'm very much interested in this ontological turn in the colonial studies, as some people would refer to, right? This is more or less where I am. Apologies for talking a lot, but this is more or less where I'm going.
That's incredible. I would be really interested in taking a look at your thesis, because like the other part of my current research, like when you came in, I was talking about my I think I don't remember if that was what was happening, but I think I was talking about my one of the papers that I'm trying to work on in my postdoc, and then the other one I think is closer to what you are saying, and it's less a critique of modern legal thought. It's more a speculation about other possibilities for legal thought, and in a way to international law that starts not from Kelsen but from Carl Schmitt, from the Nomos of the Earth, which is fundamentally a question of international law, but this very peculiar way that starts like from a very simple, very fundamental idea in order to reconstruct what international law might be. I mean, Schmitt doesn't assume that international law is a certain positive set of norms, but rather that it is a relation between different worlds that are constructed from different fundamental relations between the human and the earth. There is still some dimension, I think, of this anthropocentrism and of the relation between the human and the non-human as a fundamentally bifurcated relation, but it's a lot less abstracted than in modern legal thought, since it is in a way a kind of an anti-modern, but of course in a reactionary way, but it's a radically anti-modern way of conceiving the origins of law. And then he starts with that idea of that very interesting couple of like the first couple pages of the Nomos of the Earth are some of the most interesting legal theory pages that I've ever read. I mean, but of course he's a very questionable figure, but there's a lot of possibilities that are there, and that then you have to see exactly where it is that he is going wrong, like where it is that his reactionarism takes that in a bad direction. And what I'm trying to do is a sort of also a rereading of that through Viveiros de Castro and the ontological turn, in the sense that Schmitt starts by saying that that the earth in the medical language is the mother of law, and then he's starting with myth. And you studied with Fitzpatrick. There's a lot of discussion about how law is fundamentally predicated by a certain mythology. And I think Fitzpatrick has done probably the best work that you could do, in the sense of pointing how the kind of mythology that is related, that is in the backside, as it were, of modern law. But then that also opens the possibility of the speculative dimension, which is okay, if there is a certain mythology that is modern law, then what other laws can emerge from other mythologies or from other metaphysics, if you take Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's terms, metaphysics or mythophysics. Yeah, and then I'm starting to work on that in terms of seeing, Schmitt is starting also from a certain myth, which is a myth of this German rural worker who works the land and appropriates the land by mixing his work with the land, and then the land is a female which is fertile, and then the male worker sort of impregnates the land, and then law comes from that. That is a certain mythology, and it's even explicit in a way in or at least implicit in Schmitt's way of developing it. And then I'm like, okay, but that is just one world. That is just one production of law and he doesn't deny that either. But then what other words and what other ways of relating between different words can we imagine if we begin from other mythologies, right?
Perfect.
Then even in terms of the relation between friend and enemy, in the sense that you have also in Viveros de Castro the discussion of the immanence of the enemy in indigenous cosmologies, which itself subverts this Schmittian way of imagining how different worlds interact, which is a way in which worlds are sort of transcendent to one another and mutually exclusive, right? And then they're in a kind of unbracketed war until you establish a kind of overarching nomos that is going to include both of them. And with the immanence of the enemy, as opposed to with a sort of transcendence of the enemy that you see in Schmitt, in Amerindian cosmologies and cosmological praxis, you see that there is a kind of porosity, immanence, right, between what is us, what is people, and what is them, what is not people. And you have exchanges, you have transformations. So I think that opens a if you combine, this problem of the mythic dimension of the nomos of the earth with this, which is a kind of foundation for international law, and then this question of the political that is reread to the immanence of the enemy, you might get a very interesting picture for international law of those different worlds, which are different worlds, but are at the same time immanent and encompassing each other. And they have their different perspectives. They see each other through their perspectives, but at the same time, they can those different perspectives can be transitioned to certain practices, right? And anyway, that's quite abstract, but I think it would be interesting to see what kind of practice for an international law would be would emanate from those conceptions, sort of penetrating the way we think about it, right?
Definitely. If I can just make 2 or 3 very brief points, would be very interesting actually to talk more about this. I have been interested in a certain reading of Schmitt, and I was struck when I was reading some of his production in the 30s and 40s, which led to the nomos. And at some points, when he was actually in the context of being closer to Nazism, right? He published certain texts that at some point were very explicit in terms of saying that what he was suggesting was that they should produce in that context, conditioned by of course, the international politics going on with the war, but they should produce a new vocabulary, a new legal language. So I understand that in many ways, considering the whole importance that language had in Heidegger and people that were around him, influenced him, but also where you can find that he was aware of the work of people like Saussure and others doing the structuralist kind of engagement with language. He was aware about the structuralist politics and philosophy of language, and how that, in relation to law and politics, was indissociable of the politics of word making, right? Through the language of law, and not only law in the kind of positivist way that he so fiercely criticized, but there was something about world making through the way law is related to the emergence of concrete legal orders. He was aware, and I understand that many of his engagements with international law in that context. So, for example, his engagement with the disputation about the concept of piracy, right? Because at some point, the English, the Americans, they try to mobilize the concept of piracy, such as now you know, there's a whole dispute around the concept of genocide in Brazil and elsewhere, right? And he was aware of that. So on the one hand, I understand that his work on nomos speaks also to this kind of political ontological politics of language and law in terms of world making, and that lead me to two other things. So I found the work, I don't know if you guys know, but his work has I mean, I find it very, very difficult, but I really respect and trying to engage in with him. Hans Lindahl work, the fault lines of globalization. I find his work, it's very, very, very interesting. And rereads Kelsen, Schmidt, and this work about and about legal order, and in a very, very powerful, interesting way, I think, right? But what I think is one of the problem, and one of the kind of the things that make me hesitate and stop a bit to think more. So one of the things involved in the differentiation between the international and the world, the way I see it, is that involved on the one hand what some people like Dipesh Chakrabarti and Kathleen Davis. She has a work on the one hand on translation and Derrida, but on the other hand, she's a kind of a historian of medieval era, early modernity, and she has this wonderful book on sovereignty and periodization, and how the idea of medieval time, the construction of the periodization between, you know, medieval time and modern era, was complicit with a certain colonial construction, and her problem, and I see some aspects of the decolonial turn directly involved with this, is the globalization of political terms, political concepts, as if non-provincialized terms. So basically, it's globalization, the global politics of language, of political concepts and terms, or if you can put it, the globalization or normalization, naturalization of political assumptions, right? Or political language. Nicholas Way Gomez, I don't know if you guys know this work. It's called Tropics of Empire. He goes back to the kind of the return of Aristotle in the 12th, 13th century, right? And the speculative geography thinking, in order to show how in late scholastic work that then would influence, you know, people like Columbus and Victoria and all that people from Salamanca, but then a whole bunch of people that would think about cosmology and all the conditions of politicability for cartography in that early modern times, right? And basically he does this kind of amazing history of science in order to problematize the cosmological political theology involved in the concept of latitude, for instance, right? So in many ways, he shows how a certain racism involved in Aristotle thinking was recuperated in early modernity in such a way that was naturalized as a kind of a political assumption in centuries from the 12th until the 15 and 16 and 17 and 18 up until today. And in many ways, this kind of legitimized the way Columbus navigated south, and the way kind of, as Schmidt would then tell in the Nomes of the Earth, colonize the world. So, and here is this pivot point. If I remember correctly, one of the reasons Spivak in Can the Subaltern Speak would criticize both Deleuze and Foucault was precisely because, although their critique of the subject was super important, it was globalized. It was taken as if it could speak to every and single subject and critique of the subject. So my concern is, how can you, in the intention of speculating and thinking otherwise legally, would not do this kind of same mistake of doing so without provincialize your kind of move. So my concern is how to do this kind of post-colonial, decolonial deconstruction or speculative legal thinking, but without deprovincializing your own efforts and your own starting points and your own kind of engagements. So that's the kind of thing that I think I think it's important, and in many ways, of course, although I read him, I'm sure I do not read him or have not read him as much as you, but in terms of Viveiros de Castro and other people doing post-colonial and decolonial thought, for me, the going back to the problem of translation is important, to remind that kind of that problem of the globalization or the universalization of political terms or provincial terms as if universal, and so on and so forth. So that's the thing there.
Thanks so much. I mean, just before we move on, I just wanted to make sure, I mean, I wanted to ask Favour if she had been able to present her because you started by making some comments about Ermanno and Alex's comments, and then you touched on your research, but I'm not sure if you had enough time to actually talk about, if you want to talk any more about your interests, or if that was what you wanted to say, just to make sure I'm not skipping over that part.
Yes, I did not actually say anything about my research. So at the moment for my PhD, I am looking at something quite different to what everybody is doing, but sort of related to what Roberto was talking about in the international law aspect of it. I am looking at ethical considerations for representation, identity representation in immersive spaces through the creation of 3D avatars of virtual humans. So essentially, I think that the core of the argument that I'm trying to make is that there is a right to, or there should be a right to, an alternate identity. And I want to say alternate rather than false identity. And I am considering using Nigerian women as a case study because my understanding of the internet and its evolution, which has culminated in immersive spaces or immersive technologies as we know them today, is a space and effort that has come to be due to utopian imaginaries that people have. So the earliest cyber utopian writers like I forget his name, cyber libertarians anyway, they talk about disembodiment and freedom, a space where you are completely free from law and rules and regulations, but a lot of that has changed now. Many people do not particularly favor an understanding of internet spaces as utopian. But in the global south, I think I want to say in Nigeria, because I am from Nigeria, there's still a lot of those disembodiment, utopian, liberatory, emancipatory values that we still attach to the internet. And so while in the global north, for instance, a lot of censure has fallen on cryptocurrency and NFTs and all those things, we still very much value them and they are markers of freedom. So my argument is that the technologies like artificial intelligence, for instance, that allow you to create realistic looking fake people and realistic sounding fake voices, create or give people the skills to reinvent themselves online. And I think that the Nigerian identity in particular is very interesting to look at, because there are all these stereotypes about Nigerians, right? Like the Nigerian prince within Africa, there's a lot of xenophobia towards Nigerians due to a history of cybercrime, and other Nigerians are said to be aggressive. Nigerian men in particular are said to be aggressive, and they always try to dominate local businesses in other countries and stuff like that. So I think that Nigerians and Nigerian identity and Nigerian women particularly have a lot of reasons, I think, to want to not be Nigerian, for instance. So I am looking at evaluating reasons why people like me have valid or good reason to not be ourselves, or to mute or change certain parts of our identity online. And philosophically, I have been reading about profilicity, which describes how today, in today's social media world, when we portray ourselves online, the way we portray ourselves online is greatly influenced by second order observation. So we curate an identity based on how we believe people, based on our imagination of what we want people to see. So, and these are stuff that I have observed to be of economic and social necessity for people like myself in Nigeria who have limited opportunities. You see it in LinkedIn profiles, for instance, are curated and closely managed to portray a professional, ambitious identity. And I think that there are other such motivations that are uniquely Nigerian that I think provide strong proof that people should have a right to create alternate identities. But there are also other, I guess, criminal and ethical considerations that restrict this, like fraud, misrepresentation, safeguarding, for instance. And I am trying to explore using human-computer interaction research methods, like speculative design, for instance, how or what sort of futures would necessitate the commonization of these avatars, and how we can provide tools to ensure that people are able to represent themselves the way they want to online. So that's a summary of what I am researching.
That's incredible. Thanks so much. That's really interesting also because it connects to a whole, to me at least, the way I imagine it, a whole other branch of what's contemporary for speculative legal theory, which is the question of technology, right? We've been talking more about the decolonial or multi-world thing, and about ecology, which are other branches that are very important. But as I mentioned before, like in my thesis, in my PhD, I was actually discussing technology before I then did this move, and now I'm more focused on the relation between ecology and indigenous worlds. But for me, like, those things might seem like a big leap from one thing to another, but to me they are really close. And I think one way in which they are close is that, like, I was thinking now about what you're saying about being having a right to construct yourself as a profile or as a user in relation to new technologies. And for me, that is in a way a problem of international law, in the same sense that we were just discussing with Roberto in relation to nomos. You were talking about speculative design. Maybe you might have heard about Benjamin Bratton's work, who is a design thinker who works with this Schmittian concept of the nomos. And I think I have a lot of disagreements with his approach, but in part because he's very opposite to this whole perspectivist turn. Bratton like this. He has a big book that's called The Stack on software and sovereignty. And his point, basically, initially he's drawing from Schmitt in a way, but it's not very Schmittian actually, but he's starting from the Schmittian concept of the nomos and of sovereignty, in the sense of saying that, well, you had an international order that was based on the division of the surface of the earth among nation states that have a territory and a population. But then with platforms, you have for him a new kind of sovereignty that is capable of superimpositions. And then he describes some conflicts of sovereignty, for example, between Google and China, or between different platforms that start to act on countries, and like Facebook can intervene in American politics, or can be the means for the execution of a genocide, and then not be responsible for it. And then those superimpositions, to me, they also coincide to this superimposition at the level of the individual human body, between being a person, a citizen, an individual, and all those things that are more modern ways of articulating identity. And then also now being a user or a profile, which is something that is superimposed over the same human body, but at the same time has widely different functions and dynamics and consequences, right? And then the very idea of a right, because like when you say that I have the right to be a user, that doesn't have necessarily anything to do, with my face, with my attributes as a citizen or as a person. I can be something else as a user, right? You can think of that as a right that you're going to demand in relation to national law or to international law as we conceive it today. But at the same time, if you take platforms, like technological platforms themselves, as being a nomic entity that is different but sovereign in itself in relation to nations and to international institutions, then in a way also the rights of the user, they are demanded in a direct relation to the platform as such. I mean, that to me is interesting as well. I mean, I don't know if you're thinking of those rights more in terms of something that is relating to the state, or that's relating to the platform, or that's relating to the idea of human rights in a way, in a more general sense. Like, what did you think about that?
I was thinking of it as, I was looking at it as both a right that is exercisable, and I am trying to learn more about, well, construction or the validity of human rights themselves, because it seems like if a right is something that well, the idea of rights themselves, we think that, I guess it is common to consider them inalienable today, but really the existence of your rights, I guess, denotes something that has actually been given to somebody and can be taken away. But I am thinking about that rights. I guess my understanding of digital rights are human rights that become visible or relevant or observable, that come to life when human beings interact with digital interfaces. So when I'm thinking about the rights to alternate identities, I'm thinking about both state governments and platform governments, platform administrators, or tech platforms, generally speaking.
That's really interesting. I would love to check out what you've been producing about that.
And so sorry if I jump in, because it's 9 a.m. here and I have to leave, unfortunately. I would have stayed the whole day if possible, but I wanted to thank every one of you for this great opportunity, and I hope we can follow up soon. I don't know which are your plans, if you want to provide like a paper for next time and we can comment on a paper, or I haven't fully read the program or yeah.
So we have a basic idea of 3 different kinds of meetings that we would like to have, and this is actually a kind of a 4th kind. But the first 3 kinds that we thought about was, 1, the kind of meeting that we had with Margaret Davis or with Kirsten Anker, where you have someone that's already established as a thinker that we can interpret as a speculative legal thinker, and then you get one of their texts and you invite them to discuss their text with us. Another type is we just take some text of contemporary speculative theory in some sense, and another text from legal theory that's not necessarily speculative, and we together try to make that connection as a discussion. And then the third type would be if any of us, the participants in this group, are developing some work that is related to this or to some idea of speculative legal theory, we can also make a meeting to discuss together and to try to help each other to produce those, to finalize and to respond to criticism, to make those papers richer in one way or another. So yeah, if we like, there's no immediate demand for anyone to produce anything, but in as much as we're going to have our production, there is an encouragement to send each other this and to propose the idea of having meetings where we can discuss that, so we can sort of act also as a workshop where we help each other with our own production, and then we're going to also influence each other's production. I think in today's meeting it was very explicit how many interesting connections start to appear when you start to show each other what we are working on. At least I saw a big like network of connections forming as we were presenting. So yeah, but at the same time we have like, since we are trying to make the network grow a bit right now, reach more people, we have been wanting to have the next couple meetings, try to have some meetings at least with invitations of people who are more established. And we were thinking, actually, I wanted to ask you, because we were thinking a lot about inviting Aaron Mills, who is also there at McGill, right? Because
I know.
Yeah, because Kristen mentioned him, and I think it would be really interesting to have him as a guest to discuss some of his work. So maybe I wanted to write to him, and maybe I can write to him and like copy you, and you can sort of mediate this, and we can try to get him for maybe next month or maybe the other one. Like the idea is have a
that would
monthly meeting, and then what is going to be each one, we're going to decide along the way.
that would be great. About Aaron Mills, my understanding is that because I tried to reach him, he usually was super responsive. Um, but in the last, I would say, 2 months, he has been way less responsive to the emails. My understanding is that he may, but he may have incurred in something that is kind of overburdening him, but I'm not sure because I haven't talked to him. So one thing would be, I for sure like to put me in CC, but also I perhaps through Kirsten we may be able to reach him because I'm not sure that um, that he's super responsive in this period.
Yeah, maybe through
Particularly,
Kirsten it's going to be
yes,
easier. Yeah. But that would
because
be
I had
great
some
because yeah,
difficulty.
we are discussing also, like we've talked a lot about indigenous cosmologists today, and he's one of
Yeah.
the few indigenous scholars that I know of that are actually doing this kind of work of thinking law from an indigenous life world. So there's this thing that we were discussing about various worlds, a world of many worlds, and then what kind of law correspond to these different worlds. I think it's a fundamental contemporary work that we would have to discuss eventually. Even if he can't come, maybe we can read his text at some point. But I think
Yeah, no,
that will
I'm
be
sure
possible.
like it will be possible. It's just I had some difficulty. I just wanted to express I had some difficulty reaching him very lately. My understanding is that something happened, but I don't know. Maybe I don't know exactly. So
Yeah.
maybe so we can work through Kirsten for sure. And I'm happy to facilitate any of these contacts. And I for sure as I will be super happy to share part of my thesis as soon as it becomes a little bit more advanced, because I think I'll benefit so much from your comments and critiques and um, elaborations,
Yeah, that
and I
would be
hope we
great.
can contribute to you. Yes. So uh, I have to leave, so sorry to jump, but you keep me posted on everything, and if any of you wants to contact me for anything, like let's just remain in touch. I would love it. Yes, and thank you again for this opportunity.
Thanks so much for coming. See you
Thank
next.
you, guys. I also have to leave. Thank you, Zé. It was great
Thanks for coming.
to
Yeah,
meet you all. Sorry being late.
no worries. No, we were already close to 2 hours. Do you want to say anything else of favor? Like maybe what do you think about those connections that I tried to make? I mean, there's a lot of like I try to work on those themes of the user. Like Bratton himself, he has a chapter that is about the user in relation to the platform. And then in my thesis, I also try to develop this figure of the user as a sort of a legal concept. Yeah, but I would love to know more about the way you're actually doing that. I mean, I never took the question directly of this right to be something else from what you are as a citizen or as a person, as a user. But I think that's a very important thing, and I think that's something that is, I even joke about that sometimes in terms of what's happening now, like on Twitter, for example, where Elon Musk is clearly an anti-fake. Like he said that there's a lot of fake profiles on Twitter, and he wants to and for me that's like that's the whole thing about Twitter. I mean, there's no point in being just yourself on Twitter, right? That's just like kind of boring. Like the Facebook is a place that I always felt like it was more about being that person, but on Twitter you're a profile. A lot of my friends are just like weird images and weird names. And then I had a profile that was like that, and then recently I got something that said that I had to put my birth date and then I put a wrong birth date because it was a fake profile, so I didn't want to put my real birth date, and then I got my profile blocked for like a lot of time. So I feel like I feel like I have a right to be that person that already exists, you know, that fake person that already existed there for years, and then all of a sudden they might come and say, no, you have to present some identity, you have to put your face. And I think, yeah, I think it's very important what you're bringing up about the right to be something else, and especially in colonial context, especially in problematic violent contexts where citizenship or personhood might be already itself a form of violence.
Yes. I think I agree with you. I actually wasn't thinking about it I haven't been thinking about it in terms of the user. Although I think that is what it is. And I have also not been considering, although part of the definition of what an avatar is involves your username and your DP and your string of characters that points to you, your email, stuff like that. They all form they could all be defined as, they have all been defined to mean avatars. So avatars have been defined to mean all those things as well. What I'm particularly interested in is the graphic or visual representation of that identity. So I am thinking also, so I really like what you said about personhood and how personhood is defined in places where certain salient parts of a person's identity could be dangerous to them. And I think that this sort of decision or experience is what influences, for instance, the skin color that you give an avatar. If creating a white avatar or a black avatar or a brown one, and also and those sorts of choices. I am also concerned about, well, the creation and control of avatars or virtual humans by persons who are not part of the communities from which you would expect a certain avatar to be from. And I am thinking about this in terms of virtual influencers, for instance, virtual humans. And the very notorious, infamous one that I have come across is one called Shudu. So Shudu is a model, a virtual model, but it's not a real person. It looks like Lupita, the actress. It's very dark and slim, and it looks like a model, but it's not a real person. It has its own Instagram, and the owner or the creator of this character has signed a bunch of contracts with fashion brands, and the character wears designer clothing, but the creator is a Frenchman for that matter. So it's sort of, to me, it's problematic that this particular person is, to me, exploiting this persona in this way.
Yeah.
But yes, and I guess, but what I seem to be arguing is that people should be able to do that. But I feel like there's a power dynamic that makes the sort of communities that I am arguing should have the rights to do this, experience life differently from a Frenchman who is creating an avatar that looks like a slim African model. So one of the challenges that I am facing is how to say that I don't like that but I like this without seeming duplicitous.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's clearly some difference there that makes a difference between an African woman who has an avatar that's not an African woman and a Frenchman that has an avatar that is an African woman and makes money out of that. I mean,
Yes.
there's a clear difference there about who has the right to do what, but then how you put your finger on that, how you define that, and how do you have a criterion that is able to make sense of that? And that's a really important question. I'd be really interested in what you're going to come up with. Yeah, maybe when you have something that you want to share and we can discuss at the group, it's going to be really interesting.
Yes. Okay.
I have to close the meeting because my supervisor who uses the same Zoom is going to have another meeting soon. But thanks so much for coming. And yeah, let's keep in touch. Next month, we're going to have another meeting. I don't know yet with whom, but you should get the email. Everyone should get it out automatically. So yeah, see you next month. Thanks so much for coming.
All right, see you next month. Bye.